But getting to other types of costs, as we were discussing, this is another version of a cost that we need to take into account, and that actually are more useful to determine where you should produce. So the second group of costs, which basically implies like the fourth, fifth, and sixth cost, sorry, of that we have been seeing, are average costs. And basically, the average cost is really important because we tend to think it this way. Maybe it doesn't matter if this particular store or this particular factory within my business is having these total costs if they are producing vastly different numbers in terms of volume. So what I mean is that imagine different stores from different like shopping malls for the same brand. And it may be the case that the particular store in El Centro Comercial Santa Fe they have to pay this amount of rent, that those are the fixed costs, and they have, I don't know, like 5 workers, 5 salespeople. Those are inputs, and they basically are variable costs, and they have to pay other things that are regards to with like the number of like, let's say the number of units of clothes that they have. So you have different variable costs, and maybe they're really good at selling, and they're fantastic sales people. So what happens is that you are having to produce a bunch of clothes for that store, but because you're selling a lot of them, you have good profits in that particular store. And maybe even if the fixed cost of the rent is high, and maybe think of another store, another location in Mexico City or another place of the country. And what happens there is that instead, maybe that store has a smaller rent and even has less workers, but because they are selling less clothes, the actual profits are smaller. So you can't quite compare as effectively just by taking that type of comparison between these are the total costs from store A and these are the total costs from store B, because what you want to consider is the average cost. How much does it cost me to produce 1 unit in store A, and how much does it cost me to produce 1 unit in store B? That is a much more effective way of comparing your costs, because you're actually standardizing those costs with regards to the same level of output. And that's why you take the average of those costs. So essentially, the average cost function, AC of y, is just the total cost function divided by the number of units you are producing, your output y. Obviously, this applies to the other two costs, the fixed cost and the variable cost. They have their own particular average version. So what happens is that you have the average fixed cost, which basically implies that you take your fixed cost, whatever that was, and just divide it by the level of output you are producing for that store, for that unit, your business unit. And the average variable costs are your variable costs divided by the output level. Basically, the same idea, you're just taking the average of these costs. But this allows you to much more effectively compare within business units. So this is the second group of costs that we will see in this course. And I want to ask you if you have any questions regarding what do they mean. And I will show you more or less how they look and an example in a minute. So the average fixed cost, as you can see in the graph, is one that tends to 0. And what I mean by that is that at the beginning, your factory or the rent you are paying for that particular store is important and has an important, it has a high share of your total costs. But as you continue to produce and expand and grow, basically, and you produce and produce and produce more units, most of the total cost will be comprised of the variable cost. So the average fixed cost gets divided by a huge number instead of a small one. You're not producing any more 10 units. You're producing 1 million units or whatever. So obviously, the average fixed cost starts to decrease and shows this pattern as the graph shows you. The more and more units you produce, the less important are the fixed costs, because most of your total cost will come from the inputs you are buying and paying and hiring in order to produce that huge volume. So that's why it shows these decreasing tendency as the output increases, the production you're expanding increases, the average fixed cost tends to decrease and approximate zero, never reaches it, as it's still a small amount that you have to pay. Um, this is more or less the explanation of what I just said in written form, so I will jump it and you can see it later when you review the notes. Then this is the average variable cost. The average variable cost has a like Nike swoosh type shape, and it has this shape because it is directly linked to the number of units you are producing. So the idea is simple. On the right hand side of the graph, like when basically it's very, the idea is very self-explanatory, and is that as you continue to produce and produce and produce more units, and y tends to infinity, the average variable costs obviously keep increasing because you're producing more and more and more and more units. So the variable costs are growing at the same pace that you are growing your y. So that's why they have an increasing tendency. You have more and more variable costs, or you have to hire more workers, you have more employees, you have more inputs that you need to buy because you're producing a massive amount of final product, regardless of how much profit you may make from selling them. Suppose that you have a profit in all of them, and it basically will be an extremely profitable type business as you continue to grow. But still, your average cost will continue to increase the more you have to hire more people and the more you have to pay them and stuff like that to produce more. The tricky part comes at the beginning of the graph, on the left-hand side of the graph, where it first decreases and then increases. Do you have any idea why this is the case? Why at the beginning, as output starts to increase and you pass like from 0 units being produced to like 1, 2, 3, and like that, your average variable cost decrease and then they start to increase? Any ideas of why this phenomenon tends to happen in many industries and in most firms? At the beginning, any firm has a small amount of workers, is very conservative with regards to their costs. They tend to be like small, so they have a small office or a small store, stuff like that. And you basically just want to dip your feet in the water and try to make a splash on the market. So you are producing a small amount of units, and you have just the necessary workers and the necessary inputs to produce that. And as people start noticing you and you start to do more, have more sales, and like be a little bit more, be bigger, a little bit bigger, you start expanding your production because that's a natural thing to do. But at the beginning, you still can, let's call them, squeeze or be very efficient with your workers. What you do is that with the same level of workers that you had at the beginning, you you do things within the firm that you try to make things more efficient in such a way that with the same level of people, you produce more units. So obviously, if you're producing more units with the same level of costs, or more or less the same level of costs, then they will decrease a little bit. But there is a point, which basically is the minimum point in the average variable cost, in which you need to start hiring more people and actually start expanding in order to keep expanding. And that's why from that moment onwards, those average variable costs tend to increase no matter how efficient you are. Any questions regarding this last explanation? This is essentially the same explanation I just did. I'm gonna fix it. I'm gonna jump it. And if we combine both of these curves and we see them at the same time, we see that, as you can see, as the average variable cost, as you produce more units, your average variable cost first decreases with this explanation and then starts to increase. And the average fixed cost has more or less the opposite phenomenon, in which those costs are fixed and you essentially just start to decrease them the more and more units you have, because they are less important with regards to the overall average total cost. And I think that's the next slide. Yes, the average total cost is essentially this slide, in the sense that the average total cost is ATC, the sum of the average variable cost plus the average fixed cost. I rewrote this particular equation such that you're seeing the average fixed cost is the difference between the average total cost and the average variable cost, because it resembles this idea in the graph. At the beginning, the average fixed costs are really, really, really big when like Y is really small. But as this idea that production starts to increase and they take a smaller share, smaller percentage of the average total cost, you can see that the blue line tends to go to zero. The average fixed costs are less important the more you are producing. And for the green line, which is your average total cost, basically the more the average variable costs tend to represent, to the point at infinitum, in the limit of that, on which the average variable cost would essentially coincide and converge with the average total cost if we could reach infinity, basically. But the idea that the average variable cost tends to increase faster than the average total cost because of this difference with the average fixed cost. And every time that average fixed cost is less and less important with regards to the average total cost, and that's why the difference between the green and the red line starts to decrease the more and more units you are producing. So in this example of a car manufacturing, let's think of like, I don't know, Ford or Honda or all of these brands that have their factories in Guanajuato and like San Luis Potosí and like in the Mexican Bajío. So one of those firms, and they're taking into account that particular factory. So what happens is that the average fixed cost is all the costs they have to pay in terms of like the permits they had to buy, like or pay like for the government to start operating, the cost of buying the land, or rent it, the cost of like the industrial ship, the factory, and all the equipment they bought, like the, I don't know, like the assembly lines, that they needed to buy in order to start producing cars. Those are the fixed costs. And then as they start to produce, the variable costs are the workers they need to hire, the units of steel they need to buy from other firms, plastic, rubber for the wheels, I don't know, all of those things that they need in order to make the car. So the more cars they make, the more inputs they need to buy, the more piece of steel, the more piece of plastic, the more AC conditioner, like air conditioners they need, the more light bulbs, all of those stuff, the more workers they need. Those are their average variable costs. As long as they don't basically expand the size of the factory, like literally the size of that factory, then their fixed costs are more or less the same if they are able to produce in like 24-hour shifts. And they have like very successful manufacturing factories. They tend to have 3 8-hour shifts, and they have some workers that work like from 8 to 6 or to 4, I mean, then from 4 to 12 midnight, and then a third shift from midnight to 8 a.m. because they are producing so many units that they're exporting or whatever, that essentially they're using their capacity to its maximum efficiency. They're trying to be as efficient as possible. If they already paid for this factory, or they have to pay every month a substantial fee in terms of like the rent of the industrial ship, then they're going to use it to the maximum capacity. And that's this idea. And that's why they start to expand in terms of their production level and their output. So the average variable cost would be, how much does it cost me for every car I produce, basically every Y? What is the cost of all of these inputs that I need to use? The workers, the steel, the rubber, the plastic, all of those stuff. For every car I'm producing, what is the share of the fixed cost of the cost of this factory? And that's the average fixed cost. And obviously the average total cost is just, for every car I produce, what are the total costs per car that I'm paying basically to produce? Questions regarding this?